Kearsley Clark, professor of art history at Utah Valley University, where I focus on non-Western subjects, but I did a lot in the Eastern Mediterranean and Byzantine Empire, which is the Eastern Roman Empire, the kind of forgotten second half of the Roman Empire. So I have a great interest in Roman history. But I'm thrilled to be here today. This is my only second time moderating, so I'm not quite the moderating virgin. We'll see how well, so if you have a little questions, we'll save a section at the end for questions, but if you have a question, you want to make a comment, please feel free to raise your hand. We want to jump right in on those. Military history is kind of threatening. Military historians or military history buffs are not like freshmen, they actually know things. So I am not going to extend myself. I'll let that go to our other guests, and I'll let them introduce themselves, starting with Micheal.
My name is Micheal Boudreaux. I am a graduate student studying medieval history, but my undergrad is in specifically the ancient Roman world. I prefer dealing with the medieval period, but you can't understand the medieval period without understanding the Roman background, and obviously the Punic Wars are pretty important for that. So.
My name is John Lundwall. I have a doctorate in comparative myth and religious studies. That's not military history. I'm a project leader of the archaeoastronomy project of Fremont Indian State Park, so I study petroglyphs and sunlight and shadow that moves across them and how they're used for calendric purposes. Still not military history. Author, writer, lecturer, still not military history. But that's my expertise, and I'm glad to be here.
I'm Gordon Frye. My specialty is actually Western American and Spanish colonial, but I do teach naval history, and so that swings into Punic Wars, since that's one of the first big naval wars in history. And I also teach West Civ, or it used to be called West Civ, now it's World Civilization. And so I get to teach at least a little bit about the Punic Wars and how Carthage must be destroyed. So.
All right, well, fantastic. So let's set the scene. Let's talk about these two great rivals that come together, Rome and Carthage. What is it that brings them into this conflict? What are the differences between them, and what are the cultural challenges that force this, kind of world-changing conflict?
Sicily.
Sicily.
I was going to say NAFTA.
Yeah, Sicily. I mean, they were both interested in Sicily and the Greek colonies in Sicily, like Syracuse, and the trade with them. The thing is, you've got Rome as this great land power versus Carthage as a great naval power, and it's kind of cool. You got a juxtaposition. It's like, all right, you've got Athens and Sparta, the great. Sorry, I have to go into these weird things. You've got Athens as the naval power that's democracy versus Sparta that's oligarchy, that's land power. And then you go to modern history, you've got England that's the democracy with the great naval power versus Germany that's more of an oligarchy with land power. And then you've got the Punic Wars with Rome, which is the land power, but more with the Republic, versus the almost dictatorship of Carthage, which is the naval power. Anyway, so strange how that works. You've got some similarities, some differences with other conflicts. All of them, I think, involve trade. All of them involve culture to some degree. And trade wars tend to turn into blood wars.
John, what about culture? How do they differ in culture, and how does that play into it?
Well, Punic is a Greek word referring to Phoenician. The Carthaginians were Phoenician settlers. Carthage was one of the largest cities in the ancient world, and they dominated the Mediterranean. So they amassed an enormous amount of wealth, had the largest harbor, as far as I'm aware, a very sophisticated architectural wonder in their harbor that was able to store hundreds of boats and release hundreds of boats at a time in a military venture. And so, but culturally, it was a nexus for trade. And so Carthage becomes very important in the ancient world because, well, it's a city of 300,000 people, which in the ancient world is amazing, and it's the first city, I believe, that has like apartment buildings, 6 stories apartment buildings and fully functioning sewers and water systems. But people are moving into the city from all the surrounding areas, so there's a huge amount of commercial trade, which is why Carthage is as wealthy as it is, and it dominates the Mediterranean. And Rome wanted to get in on that, and that's where the tension begins in Sicily. But it's also kind of a nexus for intellectual contact, religious contact, so it's kind of a urban metropolis of the mid-1st millennium BCE.
Michael.
We often in West history talk about sort of east versus west. And technically Carthage is a little west of Rome, but he talked about their Phoenicians, so they are a Semitic people who sort of colonized this trade empire in the west. I do think there's a sense of othering there, the sense of they're different, their language is different, their cultures are different, their gods are different. And the Romans were happy to come and take your god from you and incorporate them if they needed to. But we see even later in Roman history how this sort of archetypical struggle ends up being sort of a defining moment even in Roman cultural history of the Aeneid. So I think it's a struggle for identity, a struggle obviously over resources and trade, but also it sort of clears the backfield for Rome. So you have, in fighting the Carthaginians and ultimately winning, they sort of establish local dominance over their sphere, which lets them deal with some of the other threats that are going on, because this is a very dangerous war.
Awesome. So let's talk about when these wars get started. So we have 3 wars. The second is being the most famous, where we have the character of Hannibal. We have Scipio Africanus, who we managed to actually have a town in Utah named for. How did that happen? So how do these wars come about, and how are they shaping the landscape in that regard? Let's talk about, the first one, how they come into conflict. They have intermediate periods where there's at times even in peace or in trade, but then other times they're in conflict. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the wars themselves and how that kind of shaped the landscape. Anybody want to take off, or should we start again at Gordon?
It begins in Sicily.
Yeah, Sicily. Well, empires are very jealous of their power, and that could be a trade empire or a physical military empire. They said there was an attempt to break into the trade empire of the Carthaginians, but I hate to admit this, I don't know the absolute details of what caused the actual immediate conflict to begin, other than the fact that it was over domination of Sicily. Sicily is kind of important in the Mediterranean. It's the largest island there, and it's adjacent to Italy. The Romans didn't like the fact that almost, sort of their territory was dominated by
not just Sicily, the whole
Right, yeah.
of Italy as well, Magna Graecia.
Yeah, and so again, the Romans were a land power. They had zero idea of what to do against a naval power. In fact, they didn't have any. They had to wait for a Carthaginian ship to wash up on the shore, and they copied it stick for stick. It was a trireme, or was it a quintreme? Quintreme, okay. And they copied it stick for stick. In fact, the Romans had to reinvent naval warfare to make it more like land warfare, because they had no idea how to go about it. So they invented a thing called a corvus, which was basically a bridge with a huge bronze beak on it. That's a corvine, like a crow. And so they could drop this bridge onto the deck of their enemy's ship and use Marines to charge across and do a land war. Because what, ramming ships? That's weird. Why would you do that? We just want to go cut their throats. And Carthaginians really didn't have a way to deal with that because that was completely foreign to them. So now, the Romans eventually dropped that because it didn't really work that well because the guys with more oar power could, pull them apart. That wasn't as successful as they wanted it to be. But while doing that, the Romans learned a little bit about naval tactics and how to go about it in a more conventional, at least for the Mediterranean, way with galleys and oar power and a little bit of sail power. But I'm getting way off base.
Just as a note, I put a Corvus on my Ram truck to board the minivan that cuts me off every morning. My parole officer says it wasn't a good idea.
Did he stop cutting you off though?
Minivans must be destroyed.
Yeah, minivans must be destroyed. Yes, for Cato. My understanding is, look, Sicily is the center of the Mediterranean, and it was a big trading port that is controlled by Carthage. And so when Rome starts expanding, they move to Sicily, and they simply move in. It was an aggressive move. And Carthage said no. And so that's where the tensions began, which ended up in the First Punic War. And it was a naval war. And just as Gordon said, that Rome had no experience with the Navy. Carthage had the, what would you call it, the battleship of the ancient world, a quintrain of five banks of oars. And so it was the fastest ship. They didn't invent it, the Greeks invented that, but what the Carthaginians did is they made it huge. There were several hundred people on that boat, most of them oars, and they put a huge bronze ram in front. And the whole strategy was to speedily, with all these hundreds of oars, ram your opponent, back off. They've got a big hole in their ship. It sinks and they drown, and they go and ram the next ship. So they're not interested in, land hand-to-hand fighting. They're just ramming ships. And they could manufacture these things with amazing speed. So if you sunk one, there was two more behind it. And so they just dominated the Mediterranean. And what the Romans had to do was they found one, or erect one, and they copied it. And they actually built several of them out of green wood that they quickly disintegrated. However, they disintegrated after their first victory at sea. And so it was enough for them to change the tide and to basically take over Sicily and the surrounding islands. And now Rome became the dominant economic trade partner in the Mediterranean. Did I get that right?
More or less.
I had to look at my undergrad notes for this. It's very similar to the last time I looked at my undergrad notes.
When you were an undergrad?
Yeah.
Last millennium.
Yeah.
I think it's really telling that in this kind of struggle you have an empire or a growing republic that is they're land-based, and their soldiers are at this point still largely citizens, right? They're people who own land, men wealthy enough to provide themselves with armor and equipment. And one of the problems that Carthage is chronically going to have is manpower. They're not a nation of soldiers. They employ other people to fight their wars for them. And I think part of why you see Rome being so successful ultimately, even though they're at a technological disadvantage at first, is this notion of, if Christopher's fighting for his country, he's a citizen, he has a stake in this republic, he's much more motivated than the North African tribesmen you hired to go fight and die for you. Money's nice and gold is nice, but losing sucks. And when you keep losing men, you're just being paid to be there. You're not tied to the polis in the same way.
There's a difference between a kind of citizen soldier who's fighting for his chance at his diploma, his 20-year service, etc., or somebody who's fighting for a much more hierarchical, kind of traditional Eastern Mediterranean, society.
Well, I also want to point out that the Romans had a lot more depth to their society. For the Romans, when they had a defeat, they just raised another army. When the Carthaginians had a defeat, it was a disaster.
Yeah.
And there's just no two ways about it.
No.
The Romans just could absorb a whole lot more punishment. And they got a lot of punishment.
Horrific loss.
Horrific loss.
Especially in the Second War.
Oh, yeah. And they lost, army after army.
Because their soldiers were farmers. They were pulling from these yeoman farmers and equestrian classes, etc.
Yeah, and it was horrific. But the Romans, because they were much more diffuse in the polity, their political power was spread out. They had more depth. They had more people who were willing to give their lives and their fortunes for their country. And also the Romans were brilliant in two places: engineering and politics. And the fact that, or government, I should say, and the fact that they managed to conquer a people, and within less than a generation, that people was completely absorbed. And they were Romans. Pyrrhus of Epirus found this out when he tried to get some of the recently conquered tribes to revolt against Rome, and they wouldn't do it. They had no interest in it. Pyrrhus, of course, is the one who the Pyrrhic victory is named after, because he said, after a few more such victories, I shall be lost. Because that's what you did with the Romans, Yeah, they could absorb the loss, and they'll come back.
So getting back to this, we have this fascinating thing. It starts over trade, it starts over conflict of culture, but what amazes me is it quickly develops into one of these archetypal existential conflicts that, we were joking about Cato. Cato the Elder in the Third War was, even if he was talking about something like weight and standard reform, he would end every speech with, Carthago delenda est. I also think that Carthage should be destroyed. Because they were so tired of it. And Tacitus says that, this is probably a little bit of, self-flattery, but he says that Rome came into an empire by accident because we had to fight these existential wars. And what I think is so interesting is we talk about the land power that is Rome, and then we get to the Second War, and Hannibal flips the script on him.
Yeah.
And then we have this whole array of fantastic characters: Hannibal, Fabius, Marcellus, and ultimately Scipio Africanus. So let's talk about how it. One of the great things is how does it generate? Even Hannibal was revered by the Romans, by later Romans, for his genius and etc. So let's talk about how these two cultures came to see each other, and how this became more than just about trade. It became about an ideology or a way of life, and to the point where they felt like this has to end.
So we talked about. Please go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that it moves from Sicily being a focus to Spain being a focus. And Cartagena, little Carthage, was another power area for the Carthaginians, and therefore, of course, that was where Hannibal raised his armies. And so the Romans are like, well, I guess we got to conquer Spain now, and so you have this an accidental empire.
Yeah, and so in modern terms, I think of it much like the Cold War. You have two opposing political systems. You have two culturally distinct and sort of polar opposite views of the world that come into conflict. Initially over this economic policy, but it does become, so we need to lock down Spain because Spain is something that comes from this war. Well, we need to get missiles to Turkey, right? It sort of expands, because if you let the Carthaginians take this island, or if you let the Romans keep this part of the Mediterranean, suddenly they're in a much better position to attack us. Yeah. And so it's almost an escalation of necessity in their context of thinking, well, if I don't defend here aggressively, then you are an existential threat to me. You become more powerful, and you have an opening into my backfield.
And dread and loathing of the possibility of what if not, fear of the other, all of these wonderful ideas that.
Well, it doesn't help that your grandfather killed my grandfather.
It doesn't help.
So now I kind of personally hate you, and I have a personal grudge against you for what happened at this battle, or the way you guys cheated me.
We're going to expand NATO into Ukraine.
That's right, yes. Which is not a threat at all to your borders.
No.
This is why I'm going to end every speech from now on with, I think pacing should be destroyed.
Make that lady. So let's, I would love to talk about some of the characters, because they do become heroes. One of the ones that I think is my favorite is Marcellus. Marcellus is basically tasked with taking Syracuse, and then you have Archimedes, and you have all his wonderful, fabulous inventions. And it starts as a misadventure that they just got to nail down Syracuse because this is where we have to, project our force over to Carthage if we don't do this. And you get Archimedes and these wonderful stories. Probably if you believe it, I know Mythbusters busted it, but I think that they were dealing with San Francisco Light, which wasn't that great. But the so-called first directed energy weapon,
Yes.
polished mirrors, etc. And these become mythic in a way, and they become kind of foundational. And then we have Hannibal crossing the Alps and the Balakanai and his elephants. What about some of those, maybe how some of those effects became foundational mythologies for Rome going forward, of how they saw themselves?
Quintus Fabius Maximus?
Anyway, Fabius.
Yes, actually, I have a little cheat sheet.
He invented Fabian tactics, which of course were used by the Fabian Society of England later. But Fabian tactics are basically just don't get beaten. If you don't engage your army, you can't be beaten. And so they went and hid out. He and his army hid out in the mud of swamps of northern Italy, avoiding conflict, avoiding an actual battle. And by being an intact army, he was a threat to Hannibal. He was always there, hanging around on the edges, so that anytime Hannibal said, "Hey, it's time to besiege Rome." Oh wait, I can't put all my troops in these siege lines because there's an army in being right over there.
And we hadn't invented the double wall tactic yet.
Right.
Yeah.
That was
Take a couple more
Caesar.
centuries.
That was Caesar.
Build a wall outside stuff.
But the Fabian tactics, he lent his name to that. Avoid an actual confrontation, but keep your army intact. And that has become a standard for the little guy since then. Take your time, avoid a frontal conflict, and just be there as an annoyance. Make sure he can't do what he wants to do.
John, thoughts?
What's the question?
So let's talk about what some of these things create in terms of mythology. Like the legend of Hannibal is just kind of, almost everybody knows about it. Or Scipio Africanus, or what these meant to the Romans. And, going, not just at the time, but going forward. What they created, about how it created Roman identity. Let's put it that way.
Well, I assume that most people have heard of Hannibal. He's argued to be the greatest military general in history. And of course, he performs some spectacular feats. He has to cross the Rhone with elephants and an army of tens of thousands. And he builds these massive 200-foot by 50-foot rafts to do this. And they have to cover the rafts with earth and hay so that the elephants don't panic, so that the elephants think that they're on ground, right? And so, he has to ferry 50, 90, how many thousand men did he have?
Numbers are fungible.
Yeah. The numbers, at least 50,000.
Maybe not.
Across the river, the river's 200 meters wide. So
What is that for those of us who aren't metric? Can you give us the imperial count there?
yes, that's
600 yards.
Oh, there you go.
I was going to say 24 inches. No, yeah, 200 meters is
200 yards.
600 feet. 600 feet. That's at the narrowest part. And so, and there's actually indigenous tribal people on the other side waiting to battle them when they cross.
Not real friendly country.
But they do it. He does it in 9 days. He builds hundreds of rafts in 9 days and ferries the entire army with elephants across. And then he has to cross the Alps. It's like Shackleton. I don't understand the psyche that is required to overcome these huge obstacles. And in order to get his elephants over the Alps, he has to literally pound boulders into rubble so that they have a path. And they do that. And somehow he's able to do all that and then defeat a 90,000 man army on the other side from Rome, right? In a colossal, I mean, it's really interesting that Carthage loses the First Punic War at sea, and they are the great naval power, and Rome has such a massive, catastrophic loss at land on the Second Punic War. It's a complete reversal.
Well, I think that part of that loss factors in is the political division at home in Carthage, where there's competing families, it's kind of an oligarchy, and the Barcanids are, even though he's having incredible success, there are those who don't like how he's prosecuting the war and don't like sending troops, never want to send troops to Italy to support him. And it shows that you can be brilliant, you can do audacious things, you can even win crushing defeats on your enemies, but if you have a politically divided home and you're not getting the support you need, you're going to lose that war.
That's eventually what happened.
Yeah. Yeah, Scipio ends up basically going to Carthage, and they wind up in a standoff, and he doesn't have the support to continue the siege in Rome, and has to come back and ends up getting taken. Let's talk about,
Well, I was going to say the worst thing that can happen to a country is to have a military genius, because usually they lose in the long run.
ultimately economics comes to bear, and numbers come to bear.
Well, I also want to point out a couple other minor things that sort of popped up. Number one is Barca, the family name of Hannibal, Hasdrubal, and Hamilcar. As I understand it, Semitic language is the same as Barak, which means lightning. So that's kind of cool. I just throw that out. Secondly, I guess there's a little bit of discussion. Maybe it's been solved by now, but I know years ago there was a discussion as to what kind of elephants Hannibal used. Were they Indian elephants, and these poor things were moved from India clear across North Africa, or were they African elephants? Of course, African elephants are notoriously uninterested in being controlled by humans. So there's questions there, but anyway, they're much bigger and fiercer than their Indian counterparts. So it's a question that I don't think has been answered yet.
There is a trade network deep into India by then, though.
Yeah, this is true.
Actually, from England to China by the first millennium BCE, it eventually becomes the Silk Road. So there's all kinds of movement of goods.
Let's talk about culture and after effects, and also like the what ifs. If this hadn't happened, what would have happened? Speaking personally as an art historian, Marcellus goes down, he takes Syracuse, and the thing that's most upsetting to him is that Archimedes gets killed in the battle, because he saw Archimedes as the prize, because he invents all these incredible machines that they were using to beat him. But then all of that Greek art and culture comes into Rome. And I can't imagine that Rome would have then not just gone against the Macedonians and the remnant of them had there not been this kind of appreciation for it. And so we talk about a Greco-Roman world. That doesn't happen without the Punic War. We talk about Mediterranean being a Roman lake. That doesn't happen. Septimus Severus is a Roman emperor, but he's ultimately Punic, and they make fun of him because he can't speak proper Latin, because he grew up in essentially in what would have been a kind of Punic environment. So all of those cultural manifestations happen because of that. What's to you would have been most interesting, and what would have happened? What's the possibilities if it hadn't happened that way?
So one of the things I find most interesting when considering the counterfactuals, we talked earlier how Rome has this great process of assimilation within a couple generations. You are essentially Roman, eventually they expand the franchise. This is great for them, but for us it means we lose a lot of the distinct cultures over time, and even the material cultures of the people surrounding them. So probably the biggest change, if Carthage had held them off or stalemated or won even in the long run, we would probably still have more of a Celtic Western Europe. So we tend to think of the Celtics as these 6 kind of fringe countries like Wales and Ireland and Brittany and France that are sort of been pushed to the fringes of society or in Western European geography. But the Celts inhabited Iberia to France, even parts of modern-day Germany, and they are essentially put down by the Romans. The Romans do a pretty good job of it, Caesar forward. And they just wouldn't have had the ability to project that power and to culturally dominate in the same way if they lose to Carthage. And if Carthage had expanded into that region, they're not interested in making you all Carthaginians, right? They want your resource, they want your trade, they're going to hire you to kill their enemies, but they're probably not subjugating you in the way the Romans did.
No, they're not going to make an empire like the Romans.
And they're not depopulating your land like the Romans did. They're not, Caesar comes in and he kills like a third of the population, they say. And so you probably have a less unified Western Europe without lacking in unified legal traditions or Latinate culture, Latinate language. It's probably a weirder place, I think.
And I personally think that it means that Persia moves into the Eastern Mediterranean and gets another life. And without the bulwark of Rome to hold back the Parthians and Sasanians, that's a completely different history there. And who knows then if Islam even would have arose, because then you have a much stronger Persia.
We probably don't get the Western civilization as we understand it, right? So and thus it changes. It's hard to predict what the world would be like because it's outside of our wheelhouse.
Yeah.
The Phoenicians, I mean, we were just talking at the first panel, they had the first reductive phonetic alphabet. That actually transforms the world, right? But it was encased in the old aristocracy, bloodline, old cosmology, old mythological structure, culture. The Greeks took the Phoenician alphabet and turned it into Greek schools, right? And then we get Plato and Aristotle, and so had Rome lost and Carthage won, we wouldn't get Plato and Aristotle, and which is, the foundations of analytical Western thinking. So it's a step out of the mythological world, the oral world, into a fully literate world, which is the basis of Western civilization, and Rome and Greeks are really the progenitors of that. So, yeah.
I could go on and on about how the military improvements the Romans saw and whatnot. But there's already been slightly touched on. There's 2 things. One, Greek achievements become part of Western civilization, Western European civilization. Most importantly of all, though, the one thing that's absolutely important for our modern civilization is Roman law. Absolutely Roman law. Because without a codified, and it didn't come until Justinian in the 400s, or 500s, but without a codified system of law, which applies to everybody, no matter what their station, money can help, but in theory,
They codify those distinctions.
yes,
It's fine.
but it applies to everyone. It is that codified, written, legal system that we have inherited from the Romans that I think makes modern culture possible. And that wouldn't have happened without that.
I couldn't agree more. I think this is a fantastic place to open it up to questions. So, wow, we got a lot of questions. We'll go in the second row here.
So you're talking about if Rome had died in the Punic Wars, none of these things would have happened. Was that on the table if Rome had lost the Second Punic War?
Oh, I think very much so.
It would have been no more Western Rome.
They wouldn't have. I don't think they would have. If they had lost the Second Punic War, Carthage isn't irrevocably weakened, and you have the Western Mediterranean as a constant battlefield, and not a safe space for Rome to expand and grow against much weaker, much less culturally impactful, organized bodies. And so Rome doesn't become the powerhouse that it does. It can't safely then go east and fight the Greek successor states. They can't go north into Gaul because there's a Spanish Phoenician colony just waiting to attack them in their backfield. And so I think if they lose that war, their position is much more tenuous. Not that they would be outright destroyed, I mean, Hannibal didn't really love them, but I don't know that he was like salt the earth vengeful necessarily.
It's hard to predict how history would go. You know, maybe Carthage and the Greeks would unite, and there would be a different Plato and Aristotle, right? It's impossible to predict how it would go, but Rome was, they were great at politics, they were great at organizing, at empire building, and then they incorporated, thank goodness, some of the best aspects of Greek culture and surrounding cultures. You know, and they did it for utilitarian purposes, to grow their empire, right? I mean, it's a bloody, terrible world full of suffering, hard work, and toil, according to Tacitus. So it's, but I, you know, my view is if Rome loses the Punic Wars, then I don't know what the world would look like, but it wouldn't be anything we would be familiar with.
Gordon, do you have a comment, or should we go through?
No, just,
Okay. Next question.
You mentioned earlier how there was still a lot of political fighting in terms of the Carthaginians with various factions within their governments being against the Barcids and Hannibal in particular. But wasn't Roman politics at the same time also still fairly factional with, well, just to pick an example, Fabius often was ridiculed for what he did, and several times other generals or senators would pop up and try to do their own thing to prove that he is a weak leader, such as, oh, I can't remember the leader who it was, but the guy who would eventually get his butt thoroughly kicked in Cannon.
oh yeah. Well, I think that, well, this is absolutely true. I think the bottom line, though, was that the Romans were ultimately willing to unite against the common enemy, whereas the divisions within Carthage, because there was nobody sitting at their doorstep until, you know, Scipio Africanus shows up. They could still, you know, do stupid stuff and have more dissension. Again, I think this goes down to the fact that when you have a much more broader-based political polity, more power is more spread out. You have more depth. You have more resilience, and I think Rome just had that resilience because at that point in time of their development, they were still their culture was still moving up, and so they still had that resilience. Where I think Carthage was more peaked, and so the political power was more concentrated. Therefore, we can look at the imperial capital of DC right now and see how fractured things are compared to, say, 80 years ago. There was a lot of dissension going on, and you ain't doing it right. But ultimately, there was a unity. So I think Rome was more where we were 80 years ago, shall we say. Carthage is more where we are today.
So if I saw, yeah, over here.
So the answer to this one might be complicated, but you describe this in Carthage, this really advanced society, a large city, apartment buildings, sewers, but that's not really part of our public consciousness. Not really much is known by the average person about Carthage. And I was curious why you think that is. Is it
They lost.
They lost. Winners write the history.
Well, and they lost, and Rome took the best parts of those things and did them as well, if not better, in the long run. So when we look back and look at ancient urban planning, we
They
go...
culturally appropriated?
Forceful sense of that word. Aqueducts, we love it, let's do that. And so we look back and we look at the things that remain, and it's the Roman versions of them. So we think of them as kind of archetypically Roman.
And they also tended to slander a lot of the Carthaginian things, although modern archaeology is discovering that they really were sacrificing babies by the thousands. So that turns out to be true. The Carthaginians had a very, very different religious system. It was much more Eastern Mediterranean and Western Semitic. I think we had a hand here, and we probably have enough time for 2 more questions after that.
What do you think would have happened if the Punic Wars never actually broke out? They just kept the tension like was still there, but it ended up being like the Cold War, and it never actually turned into an all-out war. What do you think would have happened there?
I think Michael answered that we'd have a fragmented Western Mediterranean, and then that means all of the things that Rome achieved don't happen, and that lets other powers into the environment, I think.
Yeah, Persians.
Yeah, Persians. I'm
everywhere.
very pro-Persian, so I'm rooting for the Parthians. Here we go.
So this kind of goes back like halfway through the discussion when we talked about elephants. I was just wondering, like, maybe they mixed the African elephants with the Indian elephants together, so Trump got one of those, and then raised a breed that's big and strong with some sort of maybe that could be it.
I don't know. That's about being a biology or a zoology professor.
Because they still don't breed elephants. I mean, they're all captured in the wild, as far as I know. I don't think elephants count as a domesticated animal because they can't breed them. They won't breed in captivity. As far as that's my understanding.
We got time for a couple more questions? I saw you earlier. I want to get you.
Yeah. So, Rome is a republic, and shortly, I mean, I don't know if during or shortly after the Punic Wars becomes an empire, right? What effects, I mean, how much did the Punic Wars affect that transition?
So I'm gonna fill this one because I have strong opinions on this,
Okay.
Christopher.
Yeah.
So
I'm here to heckle.
yeah. So the
I'll
rest.
disagree with whatever you say.
Yeah, that's great. So Roman notions of the Res Publica is not. We think of republic as representative democracy in the modern world. You even can read the younger Cato and Cicero, and they talk about notions of the Res Publica can be a senatorial type of republic. Cicero will even talk about a Res Publica that's run by a king, even though he doesn't love it. We make sharp distinctions between the Republican period, which ends roughly around the time of Caesar or Augustus, depending on how you wanted to define it, several centuries later. And then we move into the Principate, which is like, we're pretending to be a republic, but we're really not. And then they later get to what is more clearly defined as an empire. So I don't think the Punic War particularly has anything to do with empire in the sense of how your government runs, but it did transform them from essentially a power centrally located, primarily located on the Italian peninsula, to suddenly we own a vast array of land around the Western Mediterranean, which then springboards into empire building. So I think that's where we get empire for them.
More money, more trade, more centralized government,
Yeah.
more people fighting over the smaller
And we have more land.
The first Punic War, Carthage had to give over control of all the islands in the Mediterranean. So suddenly Rome, whether they're an empire or not, they had to be.
So we have one question over here. I think this is probably our last question.
Okay, so when was the definitive end for Punic Wars? What was the final thing that sealed the deal Carthage was beaten? How did that happen?
Even in Italy today, Italians still say, Carthage must be destroyed.
There's forever a Punic War in our hearts. That's how this works.
I would say technically when they salted the earth around Carthage so that nothing would grow, knocked it down.
Yeah, but I think by the Third Punic War, Carthage pretty much was just Carthage, and yet they were growing in power, and they're like, we're not going to do another second Carthage war.
Yeah.
And so that's it, we're done. And it moved from being kind of a quasi-tribute state to being, just another province.
Filled in the S.
I think it's important to recognize that we talked about the Aeneid a little earlier, this kind of epic Roman foundation story that kind of gives you a sense of who they view themselves as by the time of Augustus. And so central to that is the founders' interactions with the Queen of Carthage. And I think it really becomes this emblematic mythological story for them, identifying who they are, their place in the world, and what they've sort of accomplished. And so we could say in a real sense that for the Romans, the Punic Wars was always an important cultural touchstone of their dominance, of their success.
Because it scared them witless.
Yeah, but they won.
They won. And then
They got past it.
It was the good wars, sort of like World War II.
Yeah,
yeah.
that.
Excellent example. Well, I think we're out of time, but I want to say thank you to all my fellow panelists. I think this has been a fabulous discussion, and thank you very much.